Welcome to Corinne's Picks, a show about remarkable artists and creators. I'm your host, Corinne Basabe. Today we have an amazing man. We have a publisher and author from the U.S. Virgin Islands. He is a publisher of a series of incredible historical books. Welcome to the show, Enrique Corneiro.
Good morning, Corinne. A pleasure to be with you.
I hope I pronounced your last name correctly.
Corneiro, and many people get it wrong, but it's Corneiro.
Okay, great. I a big fan of yours. I've seen a lot of your work on social media and read two of your books so far and will continue to read your books. Tell me a little bit about how you got into the publishing industry.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for being so supportive of my work. I would say I got into the book writing and publishing by chance. I can remember as a child in sixth grade, we were given a reading assignment, and it was the first time we were given a book where we had to read on our own. Every other thing, math books, science books, we all did as a group, but the reading assignment we had to do individually. And the book that we were given was Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. And it's the story of her, trying to escape the Nazis in Amsterdam and stuff like that. And it's an incredible story. However, as a little boy from the Caribbean in sixth grade in the Virgin Islands, I had a very hard time connecting with the character, with the period in history, with the time, with the things that were happening. So say, for example, just the fact that she was in Amsterdam, the fact that, there was the Third Reich that was happening, the Nazis, the Holocaust, all of those things just kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. And I was so unfamiliar with any of it. I just had the hardest time relating. And even the littlest things like Anne Frank and her family hiding in the attic. Well, no one in the Virgin Islands that I knew had an attic. There was all the stories about the snow flurries coming down and them looking out the windows and seeing the people outside. And, we had never seen snow. So the littlest of things were so difficult for me to connect with. And I can remember saying to myself, I wish there were books available that told stories about us and our environment and the things that were much more relatable. So as I became an adult and had children of my own and things like that, I wanted to have books that they could read and learn about the islands and stuff like that. And unfortunately, they just didn't really exist, or they were written from a non-Virgin Islands perspective. So there's a number of books that I've written over the years that touch on some of these topics that I wished had existed at the time. So as a young boy, I love sports. So one of the big athletes that we have from the Virgin Islands is a gentleman named Tim Duncan. And we also have a number of other athletes. There's Julian Jackson, Emil Griffith, Alvin McBean. And I would, try to share these things with my friends and family, but there was no book that existed. So I ended up having to take it upon myself to collect this information and collect these stories. And in doing so, it created a book. Now, my next big challenge was, now that I've created this thing that kind of sort of felt like a book, but looked like a big stack of papers that were stapled together, was how do I make this look more digestible? How do I make it look much more professional? And just so happened, in this point in history, the publishing of books and the software that makes these things attainable are much more within the reach of the everyday person today. So the two main routes that I found that I could go was the traditional publishing route, where you contact a company and you try to sell them on your idea. And after doing so, you have to commit a certain amount of money and resources to making the project happen. So say, for example, you may have to buy 5,000 or 10,000 copies of the book before selling the first one, just to make sure that the publisher recaptures their money. Um, and then also because they're in the business of selling books, they're in control of a lot of things, primarily what the cover is going to look like, what the content is going to be like, all of these things. And number one thing is, as a publisher, their job is to help you sell as many books as possible, which was not necessarily my initial intent. My initial intent was to help to tell the stories in the way that a Virgin Islands would like for them to be told. So I instead chose to go the self-publishing route where I control the content. I control what's being said and how it's being said. I control the images, the stories, everything. Now, it is a lot more involved, but in the end, it's our islands, our history, our culture, and in the end, it's our story and our book. And all the books that I've written, yes, I wrote them, but I don't necessarily feel like I own them. They're our stories as Virgin Islanders. So that's how I kind of came about writing the books. And then there's a number of different ones that I've written. I'm more than happy to go into each one with you and the incentive and motivation behind why I did each one.
So I definitely want to show the viewers some of the books that you've written, but I do want to make a comment before we start the images, that it's so clear that you produce this history, but you do it from a Virgin Islands point of view, in that even though these are horrific times and kind of a sad subject matters in some way, you really do preserve the dignity of the people living in the 17th, 18th century. It comes through in your books, and that's something that I think only a Virgin Islander could do. So let's go to some of the images, and maybe you can, as they come on screen, please talk about each one in terms of the book covers.
Okay, thanks. And I'm going to segue a little bit out of what you said. Up until 1942, every single book about the Virgin Islands was written from an outsider's perspective. And there was a gentleman named J. Antonio Jarvis that wrote one of the very first books about the Virgin Islands called The Virgin Islands and Its People. And he was basically raked over the coals for saying a lot of the things that he said and doing a lot of the things that he did in the book. However, it needed to be said. And it was a Virgin Islander for the first time speaking their voice. And yeah, so I really just wanted to take a moment to tip my cap to him as being the first Virgin Islander to actually accomplish some of the things that I would later on down the road do. So with that being said, please do flip back to the cover. This is a story, Runaway Virgins. And the motivation for this one was, as a kid, I saw the mini series Roots, and it talked about, you know, this African that was captured and brought into enslavement in the United States, and it showed all these stories of people being whipped and being put in chains and things like that. And I wanted to know what our version of slavery was like. But unfortunately, because slavery ended in 1848, there were no recordings or anything of the words of the slaves that used to occupy the Danish West Indies. But what we did have was the runaway slave ads. In census records, you basically just have the name of the person and their age and that it was a male or female. But in the runaway ads, you can actually hear stories about what the person looked like, who their friends were, who their family were, what kind of occupations they had, whether or not they were a mason or a carpenter or a bricklayer or a seaman. Just everything you could ever hope to learn about the person without hearing it from their mouths. This book I wrote is called The Danish West Indies in Black and White. And I wrote this right around 1917, which was the 100th anniversary of the islands changing from Danish hands to American hands. The islands were Danish for 250 years, becoming American. And I wanted to give everyone a snapshot of what life looked like for the people in the Virgin Islands right around that period of time, when the islands were first getting telephones, when they were first getting electricity, when the first vehicle was being introduced, as well as like in 1928, when the first aircraft with Charles Lindbergh flew into the islands, and people came by the thousands to actually see it. The Virgin Islands Storytellers is a resource for teachers, for parents, for anyone that's looking for resources about the Virgin Islands. If you're interested in learning about Mukajumbis, there's a whole section on different authors that have written book about Mukajumbis. If you'd like to know about the different Anansi stories, if you'd like to learn about the architecture of the islands, whatever the topic may be, this is a resource to help people get guided to the authors that wrote about the books and the books themselves. The Legend of Cowfoot Woman. Any child in the Virgin Islands can tell you their own stories about the Cowfoot Woman in St. Thomas or the Goatfoot Woman in St. Croix. This book is just one of many, many stories that we have heard as children over the years, with a couple little twists at the end to add a little extra Virgin Islands flavor and spice to it. And I mentioned rescuing virgins at the very beginning. Most people, whether they're from the Virgin Islands or somewhere else, if you ask them to name 2 or 3 professional athletes from the Virgin Islands, they will normally name you Tim Duncan and then stop right there. But in this particular book, I compiled over 100 athletes from the Virgin Islands that have excelled at the highest level up to today. So say, for example, people like Milt Newton, who's the general manager for the Milwaukee Bucks that just won the NBA championship, all the way to people from the 1880s like Peter Jackson, who is a heavyweight boxer. And at one point, he was one of the most famous, if not the most famous Black person in the entire United States for his achievements in the boxing ring. And then it leads to the Coal Women of St. Thomas. This is a collection of stories, information, and about 300 images of the Coal Women of St. Thomas. The coaling was done in the Virgin Islands, and in particular in the island of St. Thomas, for about 100 years. But very little is known about these women, other than every so often you'll see an image, a pretty striking image of a woman carrying these huge boulders of coal on their head in these baskets. And, you know, they're almost like mythological creatures like unicorns and Bigfoot and stuff like that. But no, these were real people. These were hardworking Virgin Islanders trying to feed their families and trying to bring a little bit of income into their family.
Okay, so, you know, we're going to pause to go to a commercial break. When we come back, I really want to explore that book, in particular, The Coal Women, and talk a little bit about some of the decisions that you made in publishing that book, as well as the history. So we'll be back in a few. We have Rico, Enrique Corneiro.
Enrique
And we'll be
Corneiro.
Corneiro.
Listen, you're my friend.
I noticed you haven't really been yourself recently.
Yeah, I feel like something's up.
How are you?
Are you okay?
Is there anything you want to talk about?
I just want to know how you're feeling.
And listen, even if you don't know what to say, I'm here to talk.
No matter what you're going through,
I just want you to know I'm here.
I've got your back.
when you want to talk, I'm here.
UNICEF Kid Power is offering free online dance and exercise videos with a twist. Kids stuck at home can get active and save lives locally and around the world. Sign up for free at unicefkidpower.org.
When times get dark, we can't see the help that's all around us. Let 211 be your guiding light for help with food, healthcare, and other resources.
211, how can I help you?
Call 211 or visit 211.org. 211. Get connected, get help.
Welcome back to Corinne's Picks. We have a wonderful guest today. We have Enrique Corneiro. We were talking about Runaway. I'm sorry, we were talking about Coal Women of St. Thomas before we went to break. I want to continue with that a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit more about the book, and maybe we can start seeing some of those images?
Yes, to set the stage, when emancipation of the slaves took place in 1848, everyone really wanted to exit the agricultural scene if at all possible. They wanted to just get as far away as they could from the plantations. People in St. Croix didn't have as many other options, but in the islands of St. Thomas, St. John, and nearby Tortola, a lot of people found the Charlotte Amalie Harbor that inviting place to go. And what was happening at the same time also is ships were changing from sailing ships to steam-powered ships. So a trip that would take from Europe to the Caribbean 2 months to happen when you're dealing with the prevailing winds could now happen in 2 weeks because you're using steam-powered engines. So it made the Virgin Islands and its coaling station one of the most important stations in all the Caribbean. Now, with that being said, they needed a workforce that was cheap and readily available. And just so happened at the time, there were lots of unemployed women in the Virgin Islands because slavery was now over. And, yes, during the day, they may do laundry and cooking and taking care of kids and stuff like that. But then to supplement their incomes, a lot of them would work as coaling women. And the way the coaling industry worked was there were huge barges that would bring coal from West Virginia and like the Pocahontas coal mine, or as far as way as Cardiff in South Wales. They would load up all this coals on the island of Hassel Island. And then as kind of like how you go to the gas station, the tankers would bring the gas in huge amounts. But then as you pulled up in your vehicle, you would just get as much as you needed for your particular trip. So what we have here is images of the various coal women, and their ages, believe it or not, were as young as 14 years old and as old as 76. And to get paid, to get compensated, as you can see in this image here, you had to carry a basket of coal from the pile onto the ship up the ramp and dump that basket, run back and get another one. And for doing so, you were paid 1 penny per trip. Now, what that meant is you had to make 100 trips to earn $1 in a day. So it was very laborious type work to be done. And, the gangplanks are very thin. But still, you had to get this kind of work done. You had to get it done within a certain amount of time because the ship also had to sail to its next port. So you have these men and women, but predominantly women would take care of the coaling of the ships. And here's a couple of images of where it would actually take place on Hassel Island. There were 4 major coaling companies on the island at the time, with the largest and most important one being the Hamburg American Line. At one point, Hamburg was the largest employer on the island, and they employed about 300 or 400 people. So you can imagine that this was a major, major important industry for the island of St. Thomas at the time. Now, In some of the images, you see cranes in the background. It was also very dangerous work. You're here working with open coal and coal dust getting into your lungs, and you're also working around heavy equipment that could easily injure you. And this is long before the days of OSHA and occupational safety and stuff like that. And then also sometimes ships would arrive at nighttime. So it could be 8 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock at night, a ship comes in and they just want to get cold and sail out first thing in the morning. So the ship's horn would blow, and then out of nowhere, all these hundreds of women in the middle of the night would start heading to the wharfs to go over to Hassel Island to coal the ships. And I mentioned how dangerous it was. It wasn't unusual for these overloaded little boats going over to Hassel Island to capsize. And everyone fall off and some be lost forever. Also going up and down the gangplanks, it wasn't unusual for someone to trip or bump someone and they fall off. And again, it's dark outside, you can't see what's happening. It was a large or a high fall that they suffered from, and you may not find that person till morning to rescue him. So very dangerous work. And there was the Hamburg American Line's main office. At one point, like I say, Hamburg was the main employer on the island. When the Americans purchased the islands from the Danish West Indies, purchased the Danish West Indies from Denmark, it was on the onset of World War I, where the United States and its allies were fighting against Germans and Kaiser Wilhelm. Well, one of the things that happened was the Americans seized all of the German property on the island. So they took over the coaling wharfs, they took over the buildings, they took over everything. And a big part of that was protecting themselves from, possible Nazi invasion. So in addition to the industry and the dollars that it brought in, the coaling industry and protecting the coaling industry from falling into German hands was a huge thing for the Americans and for the people of the Virgin Islands.
So I thought it was very interesting. I thought it was very interesting, that whole conversation about the different currencies that were used at this time period to pay the workers, and how it was sometimes detrimental to these coal women. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. In the United States, every year, the United States Mint prints certain amount of pennies, certain amount of nickels, certain amount of dimes, certain amount of quarters, certain amount of bills. It wasn't that way in the Danish West Indies. The main mint in Copenhagen, Denmark, would print currency as needed, or as they anticipated was needed. So what was happening was you may have some pennies printed in the year 1859, but then the next time they were printed was in 1889, like 20 or 30 years later. And what happens when people run out of the resources that they need? They start using what is readily available. So they started using American coins, Spanish coins, Mexican coins, any currency that they had that was readily available, they would use. And just so happened, the Mexican silver was a readily available currency. So what was happening is they would use the Mexican coins to pay the laborers, and that worked fine until it didn't work fine anymore. The value of the Mexican silver started to collapse, and in turn, what happened was you had people that were carrying these baskets for a penny per trip, but what was happening was they were only getting compensated to the effect of maybe half a penny or a third of a penny's worth of value because the silver had gone down. Also, you had a number of merchants on the island, about 22, 23 different merchants that decided, well, we're just going to print our own currency. So we're going to print our own coins. And that worked well until it didn't work well. So say, for example, if you needed a pound of ice or a pound of flour or what have you, that's fine. You take one of the little tokens and you go buy it. But then what would stop the merchant from tomorrow saying, it's now 2 tokens or 3 tokens or 10 tokens for a pound of ice. You really had no recourse because the coins were only accepted and only able to be used within that particular store. So sometimes they call them merchant tokens, sometimes they call them tallies. But as far as the people of the Virgin Islands were concerned, they wanted no part of it. They just wanted to get $1 for $1. They wanted to get $1 pay for $1 day's work.
So tell me a little bit about your research process. Where are you getting a lot of these images and photographs and information from?
That's a great question. Most of the material that I have is things that I collected in researching my own family history in the Virgin Islands. And that's actually where most of it started. So I was able to trace my ancestry on my father's side of the family back to the 1700s, and on my mother's side of the family back to about 1810. And what happens is, as you're doing this research, whether through the National Archives, through the family history centers, through ancestry.com, old newspapers, spent a lot of time walking through cemeteries, reading gravestones. Any and everywhere that you can collect information, you can imagine, I've found it. One of the best places for any budding genealogist or person wanting to research their family history, go through old photos, especially photos from the 70s, the 60s, the 50s. Turn the picture over. It was very common for people to write notes on the back of those pictures to say who's in the picture, what's going on, what's happening. Because without that, many of the images that I have, I would never known what they're talking about. But a lot of times it explains, okay, this is what's happening. This particular ship is in town to do some coaling, and these are the people that are helping getting it done. Or special dates and times are put on there. Also, sometimes if you have old family Bibles and stuff like that, you'll have lots of good information on there that chronicles stuff that isn't recorded anywhere else.
We have about 2 minutes left of the show. I want to thank you so much for being on the show. I wish we had gotten a little more of a story about your, I think it was your grandfather was kind of part of that coaling industry. Didn't he own a store, or he was an official during that time? So I wish we had a little bit more about that story. But thank you for being on the show.
I guess my last few words I'd like to share with everyone is that there's a story inside all of us. It's just a matter of whether or not you feel it's important enough to share that story and pass it on to the next generation. If so, take that first step. I tell people all that time, the hardest thing to do is write that first page. If you can write the first page, you can write the last page.
Okay, thank you. That's it for this episode of Corinne's Pick. Tune in next time. Thank you.
And thank you.